The first encounter. The Academy was known throughout the galaxy as a beacon of knowledge, a place where the brightest minds from every corner of the universe gathered to learn, to innovate, and to push the boundaries of their species. The hum of its atmospheric processors had become a familiar sound, almost like a heartbeat to those who had spent years within its walls. For most, the corridors and lecture halls of the Galactic Academy were places of ambition, progress, and unparalleled intellectual growth. Yet, for one young human, Matthew Winchester, these same halls would become a prison of impossible expectations. At the age of just 12, Matthew was unlike any other student the Academy had ever seen. His mind was a labyrinth of sharp corners and brilliant connections, a child prodigy whose academic record was flawless. His ability to absorb complex theories in mathematics, physics, and computational sciences was unparalleled, even by the standards of the most advanced alien species that walked the Academy's halls. He wasn't just a student. He was a phenomenon. Yet, no one could have predicted the storm that was brewing just beneath the surface of that brilliant mind. It was an early morning when Matthew walked into Professor Zalthor's office for the first time. Professor Zalthor was known for his formidable intellect and stern demeanor, having taught generations of students, many of whom went on to lead some of the most influential scientific endeavors in the galaxy. The professor's antennae twitched as he observed Matthew's entrance, noting the slight nervousness in his gait, the way his fingers nervously adjusted his pristine academy uniform. It was clear that this human boy, despite his brilliance, was still just a child. "Come in, young Matthew." Professor Zalthor gestured toward the seat across from him. His voice was calm, inviting, as he looked up from his datapad. "I've been looking over your application." Matthew took a deep breath and sat, his mind racing with excitement and anxiety. This was his moment, the moment he had dreamed of since childhood, the moment where he would prove his worth. The datapad in front of him displayed his perfect academic record, perfect grades in every mathematics course offered at the Academy, several published papers in peer-reviewed journals, and glowing recommendations from his instructors. He was, in every way, the perfect student. But Professor Zalthor, like the other faculty members, wasn't interested in accolades or titles. He was interested in something far more important: potential. "I have read through your papers on quantum algorithms and multidimensional computational matrices," Professor Zalthor began, his voice steady. "And I must admit, they are exceptional. But theory is one thing, Matthew. The practical application of those theories is what truly separates the exceptional from the ordinary." Matthew's heart raced. He knew what the professor was referring to: the infamous FTL, faster than light, computation course, the one that separated the greatest minds from those who could only dream of reaching such heights. The theory was easy for Matthew. He had spent countless hours studying it, mastering the equations and algorithms that many students his age couldn't even begin to comprehend. But the real challenge, the practical application, was something entirely different. "I understand, Professor," Matthew replied, his voice steady despite the swirl of emotions within him. "I've read about the challenges faced by your most advanced students when it comes to implementing the theory. But I believe that with the right guidance, I can overcome those obstacles." Professor Zalthor regarded him for a long moment, his antennae swaying gently. There was something about Matthew's demeanor, his earnestness, his unshakable belief in his abilities, that made the professor pause. He had seen many students come and go over the years, but there was something different about this one. Something special. "Very well," Professor Zalthor said after a pause, his voice warm. "We'll enroll you in the advanced FTL course. But remember, Matthew, potential alone isn't enough. The path ahead will be difficult, and you must be prepared for failure. I hope you understand that." Matthew nodded, his mind already racing with thoughts of the challenges that lay ahead. He had no doubt that he would succeed, not because he was arrogant, but because failure had never been a concept he truly understood. He had always excelled, But little did he know that the Academy was about to show him a lesson that would shake him to his core. Weeks passed, and Matthew dove headfirst into the FTL computations. His mind seemed to soar through the complexities of the calculations, effortlessly grasping concepts that baffled even the most seasoned scholars. But when it came time to implement the theories, to guide a ship through the vastness of space, using only his calculations, something went wrong. No matter how hard he tried, Matthew couldn't make the numbers work. The complex gravitational fields, the quantum fluctuations, everything that should have been second nature to him felt like an insurmountable wall. The more he struggled, the more the reality set in. His brilliant mind, so adept at theory, could not bridge the gap to the practical world of FTL travel. His hands trembled as he stared at the display, a long string of failed calculations mocking him, where others, alien species with minds designed for this very purpose, could intuitively sense the flow of space-time and the patterns of gravitational fields. Matthew could only see numbers and equations that refused to cooperate. It was then that the cracks in his confidence began to show. The young prodigy who had once believed that he could conquer any challenge now found himself paralyzed by the limitations of his own mind. The Academy, which had once celebrated his genius, now watched him with growing concern as his grades plummeted. His classmates, many of whom had once looked up to him, now whispered behind his back. They were navigating the stars with ease, while Matthew, despite his theoretical brilliance, struggled to even make a basic jump. Professor Zolfor. Matthew's voice was quiet as he approached the professor's office once again. His shoulders were slumped, and his usually sharp eyes were clouded with frustration. I don't understand. I can explain every aspect of the theory, but when it comes to applying it, Matthew, the professor interrupted gently. Theoretical understanding and practical skill are not the same thing. Not every mind is built to process the dynamic variables of FTL navigation. We knew this would be a challenge. Perhaps it is time to explore other methods. But Matthew wasn't ready to hear that. Not yet. He had always believed that failure was simply the precursor to success, that with enough effort, he could overcome any obstacle. But as the weeks turned into months, that belief began to falter. His frustration grew. And soon, the unthinkable happened, an outburst in class that would change the course of his future. In the heat of an argument with a fellow student, Matthew lashed out in anger, something he had never done before. The tension in the air was palpable, and for the first time, Matthew's brilliance didn't seem like a gift. It felt like a burden. It was in that moment, with his future hanging in the balance, that the Academy made its decision. Matthew Winchester, the 12-year-old human genius who had once seemed destined for greatness, was expelled from the Galactic Academy. The announcement came as a shock to many. How could the Academy, a place that prided itself on nurturing the greatest minds in the galaxy, fail a student so young, so gifted? But the truth was undeniable. Matthew's struggles were not just academic. They were personal, and in the eyes of the Academy, that made him a liability. As Matthew walked out of the Academy's grand doors, the weight of failure pressing heavily on his shoulders, he made a vow. He would find a way to prove himself. He wouldn't let this setback define him. The world, the galaxy, was vast, and if the Academy couldn't see his potential, then he would carve his own path. He didn't know it then, but Matthew Winchester's journey was far from over. And the future would come to recognize his name as one of the most revolutionary minds to ever exist. The struggle and the promise. The years following Matthew Winchester's expulsion from the Galactic Academy were years of quiet determination. The grand doors of the Academy closed behind him, but the lessons from its hallowed halls never truly left his mind. They lingered in the corners of his thoughts, the mathematical equations, the quantum theories, the failed FTL navigation trials. The rejection was painful, but it ignited something in Matthew, a fire, a drive that burned brighter than ever before. He couldn't let this be the end of his journey. The galaxy was vast, and he knew that his mind could change the course of human history if he just had the opportunity to apply himself in the right way. Matthew had always known that failure was a part of life. It was the one lesson he had taken from his time at the Academy, even if he had never fully understood it before. But now, with the weight of rejection on his shoulders, he realized that the Academy had been too rigid, too focused on its centuries-old methods. He didn't need to change the way his mind worked. He needed to change the way the world thought about problems. Matthew spent the next few years traveling. He didn't have the luxury of a prestigious institution to guide his studies, but he had something far more valuable: the freedom to explore, to experiment, to fail without the fear of being expelled. He roamed the galaxy, visiting isolated research stations, working with fringe scientists, and studying the groundbreaking advancements of other species. The knowledge he gathered was invaluable. He studied alien computing systems, learned their ways of thinking, and soon began to understand something that had eluded him at the Academy. Space-time was not just a series of numbers and equations. It was a living, breathing entity, one that responded to new ideas, to fresh perspectives. It was a realm that could be shaped and understood in ways beyond the traditional methods he had been taught. For years, Matthew worked alone. His resources were scarce, and his reputation in the academic world was tarnished. Few were willing to take a chance on the expelled human prodigy, but Matthew didn't mind. He was used to being underestimated. The only thing that mattered was his work. Slowly but surely, he began to make breakthroughs in FTL navigation, breakthroughs that no one had thought possible. He cracked codes that had stumped the greatest minds in the galaxy, bending the laws of space and time to his will. It wasn't just about speed. It was about efficiency, precision, and the ability to navigate through space without the need for the complex calculations that had stifled him at the Academy. One day, as he sat alone in a small, cluttered lab on the edge of the galaxy, Matthew finally made the breakthrough he had been waiting for. It was a small thing at first, a shift in the way calculations were made, a simplification of the quantum variables that had once seemed so insurmountable. But as the data streamed across his display, he realized that this was it. This was the answer. It wasn't just about AI or automation. It was about human ingenuity. Matthew had found a way to integrate artificial intelligence with organic understanding, creating a system that allowed for intuitive, real-time space navigation without the limitations of traditional FTL methods. The system wasn't perfect yet, but it was a start that could change everything. But as he sat back in his chair, staring at the breakthrough he had just created, a new thought crossed his mind. The war. The galaxy-wide conflict that had been raging for years, with Earth and its allies fighting desperately to survive. The human homeworld was struggling, its people trapped in a system with unstable gravitational fields that made FTL navigation nearly impossible. And Matthew, sitting in the quiet of his lab, realized that this discovery wasn't just a personal triumph. It could save countless lives. Matthew knew that if he could just get this technology into the right hands, the war could be turned around. But that was easier said than done. No one would believe him. After all, he had been expelled from the Academy. His name was synonymous with failure in the academic world. But Matthew wasn't interested in their opinions anymore. He had something they didn't, something far more important than prestige or recognition: the power to change the future. He began to put together a plan, one that would take him back into the heart of the galaxy, back to the front lines of the conflict. He had the technology. He had the knowledge. Now, he just needed the means to share it with the world. It was in a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of a neutral planet that Matthew met the first person who believed in him. Her name was Lieutenant Jara Loken, a military strategist who had heard whispers of a new FTL navigation system that could help humanity overcome the odds. She had been tracking Matthew's work for months, following his progress from a distance, and when she finally reached out to him, Matthew didn't hesitate. The war was escalating, and time was running out. She explained to him the gravity of the situation. Earth's defenses were crumbling, and the galaxy's most advanced fleets couldn't make it through the gravitational anomalies around the human homeworld. The enemy was exploiting this weakness, attacking with impunity, knowing that the human forces had no way of escaping or reinforcing their position. Matthew listened intently, feeling the weight of the galaxy's fate pressing down on him. It wasn't just Earth at risk. It was all of humanity, all of civilization. If he didn't act now, the galaxy would fall into the hands of the enemy, and the future he had envisioned would never come to pass. "You have the technology, Matthew," Lieutenant Loken said, her voice steady and determined. "You have the solution, but we need it now. The human fleet is running out of time." Matthew nodded slowly. He knew she was right. This wasn't just about science anymore. It was about survival. The system he had developed had the potential to turn the tide of the war, to give humanity the mobility they needed to fight back against their enemies. It was a risk, one that could either succeed beyond anyone's wildest expectations, or it could fail catastrophically. But Matthew didn't have time for fear. The stakes were too high, and his promise to the human race, to his people, was too great. "I'll do it," he said finally, his voice filled with unwavering resolve. "I'll take this to the fleet. We'll make it work. I'll find a way." The next few months were a blur of action, as Matthew and Lieutenant Loken worked tirelessly to adapt his navigation system for the human fleet. They faced countless obstacles, technical, logistical, and political, but Matthew's determination never wavered. He had seen the consequences of inaction. He had witnessed firsthand the devastation caused by the war, and he refused to let humanity fall into extinction. It was in the final days before the new system was deployed that Matthew received a message. It was from his old professor, Zolfor, the one who had once believed in him. The message was short, but it carried weight. "Matthew, I've seen the reports. I didn't believe in you, but I was wrong. You have done what we all thought impossible. You have shown us the future." For the first time in years, Matthew smiled. The road had been long, and the challenges had been greater than he ever anticipated, but he had done it. He had not only proven himself to the Academy, to his mentors, but to the entire galaxy. And in that moment, he realized that the greatest triumph wasn't in the technology or the systems he had developed. It was in his unwavering belief that humanity could rise above its limitations. The new path. The day Matthew's breakthrough was deployed marked a turning point not only for the war, but for the future of humanity itself. The human fleet, once trapped within the gravitational anomalies around Earth, suddenly found themselves with a new kind of freedom. The artificial intelligence system Matthew had developed allowed for instantaneous navigation, cutting through the quantum fluctuations that had made FTL calculations almost impossible in Earth's system. Ships that had once struggled to jump through space now moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, executing maneuvers that were once thought impossible. The results were immediate and staggering. The enemy, who had been exploiting the gravity wells surrounding Earth, suddenly found themselves unable to predict the movements of the human fleet. The tides of war shifted. The tactical advantage was no longer theirs. Humanity had found a way to fight back, and Matthew Winchester, once a child genius expelled from the Academy, was the one who had given them the tools to do it. But while the battle for survival was being fought in the stars, Matthew was not resting on his laurels. He had always known that success was never the end. There was always more to be done, more to be discovered, more to be created. The victory in space was just the beginning. After the first successful deployment of the new system, Matthew received a flurry of messages from all corners of the galaxy. His reputation, once shattered by his expulsion from the Galactic Academy, was now a symbol of resilience and innovation. His eye-assisted FTL navigation system was heralded as one of the greatest technological advancements in recent history, but Matthew wasn't interested in accolades. He knew that the galaxy was vast, and that his work was far from finished. One day, as he sat in his small, dimly lit office on a distant research station, Matthew received a message that would change the course of his life once again. The sender was someone he hadn't heard from in years, Professor Zolfor. "I've been following your progress, Matthew," the message began. "I never thought I would see the day when I would say this, but I was wrong. Your work is extraordinary, and it has opened my eyes to possibilities I had long since dismissed. We need to talk. The Academy is changing. There is a place for you here, if you're willing to return. But I understand if you're not." Matthew sat back in his chair, his mind racing. The Academy. It was the place that had rejected him, the institution that had failed to see his potential. And yet, here it was, extending an olive branch. His heart swelled with a mixture of emotions: anger, pride, and curiosity. Part of him wanted to turn his back on the Academy forever, to continue forging his own path without their approval. But another part of him realized that this was an opportunity he couldn't ignore. The Academy had the resources, the students, the infrastructure that could help bring his ideas to a wider audience. It wasn't just about proving himself to the people who had once dismissed him. It was about creating a legacy that would last. After much thought, Matthew made a decision. He would return, not as a student, not as a prodigy, but as a teacher. The very institution that had once expelled him for his limitations would now be the place where he would shape the future of FTL navigation, and more importantly, the future of education itself. Back to the Academy. A new vision. The Academy had changed in the years since Matthew had been expelled. There were new leaders, new approaches, and a sense of uncertainty that permeated its once sturdy walls. The institution had felt the pressure of the galaxy's rapid technological advancements, and some were beginning to question whether the old ways of teaching were still sufficient. Professor Zolfor, once an unwavering supporter of tradition, had seen the cracks in the system, and he knew that change was inevitable. But he had also realized something else. The future needed someone who understood both the old and the new, and that someone was Matthew Winchester. When Matthew arrived at the Academy's sprawling campus, he was met with a mixture of awe and skepticism. His reputation had spread far and wide, and while many were eager to learn from him, others remained doubtful. The old guard, the professors who had spent their careers teaching traditional FTL navigation, were not easily convinced. They viewed Matthew's system as a novelty, a mere tool that would eventually fade away. But Matthew wasn't interested in convincing them. He had a vision, and he knew that the future belonged to those who were willing to challenge the status quo. He began his work quietly, meeting with select students who were open to new ideas, students who shared his passion for innovation and curiosity. Together, they explored the new boundaries of space-time, developing new techniques and refining Matthew's eye-assisted navigation system. It wasn't long before word began to spread. The new system was far more than a mere tool. It was a paradigm shift. It was a new way of thinking, a new way of seeing space itself. But even as Matthew's influence grew, there were those within the Academy who resisted change. They clung to the old ways, unwilling to accept that their methods were no longer sufficient in the face of new challenges. They viewed Matthew as a threat to their authority, a symbol of everything they had failed to predict. And in the face of this resistance, Matthew found himself once again standing at a crossroads. Would he continue to push for change, even if it meant alienating the very institution he had returned to? Or would he compromise, allowing the Academy to maintain its outdated systems at the cost of progress? The decision was never easy, but Matthew knew what needed to be done. He had never been one to compromise on his beliefs, and he was not about to start now. He believed in the potential of the human race, in the ingenuity and creativity that could overcome any obstacle, and he believed that education, at its core, was about empowering minds to think differently, to question the world around them, and to forge their own path forward. The turning point. As Matthew's students began to master his new system, the results were undeniable. The human fleet, now using his eye-assisted navigation technology, had become a force to be reckoned with. The tides of war were turning in humanity's favor. But it wasn't just the fleet's success that was changing the course of history. It was the students themselves. They were no longer passive recipients of knowledge. They were active participants in the creation of the future. One particular student, a young woman named Zora, became Matthew's most promising prodigy. Zora was brilliant, a quick learner who absorbed new concepts with ease. But what set her apart was her drive, her refusal to accept limitations. She reminded Matthew of himself, of the young boy who had once walked the halls of the academy, determined to prove himself, to push the boundaries of what was possible. "Professor Winchester," Zara said one day after class, "I've been thinking. If we can simplify space-time navigation using AI, what else can we simplify? What other areas of science could we revolutionize?" Matthew looked at her, a spark of excitement igniting in his chest. She was thinking beyond the limits of what he had taught her, beyond the confines of their current work. And in that moment, Matthew realized that the future wasn't just about space. It was about everything. The future of education, the future of science, the future of humanity, all depended on the willingness to think differently. "This," Matthew said, his voice filled with resolve, "is only the beginning. A new legacy." The Academy's grand lecture halls, once filled with the weight of tradition, had started to feel different now. There was a quiet hum of energy in the air, the kind that precedes something monumental. The atmosphere had shifted from one of rigid structure to a new kind of dynamic. Ideas that had been silenced or marginalized for centuries were now given the space to breathe and grow. Matthew Winchester, once an outcast, had become the spark of this revolution. Despite the mounting resistance from the old guard, Matthew pushed forward with his vision. His eye-assisted navigation system, which had already proven to be a tactical game-changer in the war, was only the beginning. Matthew knew that the key to humanity's future wasn't just in the ability to navigate the stars. It was in their ability to think differently about every problem they faced, to take what they knew and apply it in ways no one had considered. This was his mission: to guide the next generation of thinkers into a future where limits were not constraints but challenges waiting to be overcome. Each day, Matthew worked tirelessly with his students, encouraging them to question, to experiment, to explore new ways of approaching the universe's mysteries. But in the back of his mind, there was always a lingering question: how could he make the Academy understand? How could he convince those entrenched in the old ways that the future was not something to be feared but embraced? Zara, his brightest student, had become his closest ally in this endeavor. She was a quick study, always asking the right questions, never satisfied with surface-level answers. It was clear to Matthew that she had the potential to do even more than he had. Together, they delved into new realms of research, exploring everything from bioengineering to quantum computing, and even working on ways to use their newfound understanding of space-time to unlock faster, more efficient energy sources for the galaxy. The possibilities were endless, but their greatest challenge was convincing the Academy's leadership to support their ideas. "We have to show them that our work isn't just theoretical anymore," Zara said one afternoon, her face lit by the glow of the data pads displaying their latest work. "The war might be over, but the future still needs us. We have the tools to change everything, from the way we travel to how we power our cities. The Academy needs to see that." Matthew nodded, his mind racing. Zara's words echoed his own thoughts. The technological advancements they had made together were extraordinary, but their greatest hurdle was not technological, it was institutional. The Academy had never been known for its ability to adapt quickly. It had survived for thousands of cycles by clinging to its traditions, and the thought of uprooting that stability was, to many, inconceivable. But Matthew was no longer interested in mere survival. The Academy needed to evolve. It needed to change, or it would be left behind, just like the outdated systems that it had so long upheld. The breaking point. As the months went by, the tension within the Academy grew. The old guard, led by professors like the once revered Dean Fornix, continued to decry Matthew's methods. They called his work unproven, reckless, even dangerous. Their arguments, filled with the weight of centuries of tradition, stood in stark contrast to the groundbreaking work being done by Matthew and his students. "We are the Galactic Institute of Technology," Dean Fornix said during one of the more heated faculty meetings. "Our methods have stood the test of time. We do not abandon them for the sake of novelty. These new ideas of yours, Matthew, are nothing more than a distraction, a dangerous diversion from the established path." Matthew sat in silence as the professor continued, the words like nails scratching across a chalkboard. He had heard this argument countless times, but each repetition felt more hollow than the last. Dean Fornix's words were based in fear of change, fear of the unknown. But Matthew had seen too much to be afraid of change. He had seen the war, the suffering, the lives lost due to humanity's inability to adapt. He could no longer sit back and watch the Academy resist progress. "This isn't about novelty," Matthew finally interjected, his voice calm but filled with an unwavering conviction. "It's about the future of humanity. We can no longer cling to methods that limit us. We have the potential to do so much more, and the galaxy needs us to act." The room fell silent. Professor Zolfor, who had been an ally throughout this struggle, nodded in agreement. The others, however, remained unmoved. "You're asking us to tear down everything we've built," another professor, Professor Grix, muttered from across the room. "For what? To build something that may or may not work." "No," Matthew replied, standing to his feet, his eyes burning with intensity. "I'm asking you to stop fearing the unknown. I'm asking you to take a step forward with me, to build something that will last, not just for us, but for every generation to come." For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of his words hung in the air, like a challenge thrown down at their feet. This was no longer a debate about technology or navigation. This was about vision. And Matthew Winchester had a vision, one that was bigger than the walls of the Academy and the generations of traditions that had shaped it. A new era. In the days that followed, the Academy found itself at a crossroads. The old guard could not ignore the results of Matthew's work. The new AI-assisted navigation system had saved countless lives during the war, and his students were producing innovations that had never before been imagined. But despite these successes, the leadership still clung to their belief that the old ways were enough, that the future could be shaped by preserving the past. But Matthew was persistent. He didn't just want to make a point. He wanted to change the system from the inside. He began working with Zora and the other students to build a curriculum that blended the best of the Academy's traditional methods with the new approaches they had discovered together. It wasn't easy, and the resistance from the faculty remained strong, but Matthew believed in the power of knowledge and the potential of every student. He was determined to show them that true education was not about rigid structure. It was about fostering curiosity, encouraging experimentation, and creating an environment where innovation could thrive. The turning point came when a proposal was submitted to the Academy's governing council. It was a bold proposal, one that called for the integration of Matthew's AI-assisted navigation system into every aspect of the Academy's courses, from introductory classes to advanced research. The proposal argued that this new way of thinking, this new approach to science, was not just a tool, it was a philosophy. It was about understanding the universe in a new way, one that encouraged not just knowledge but creativity. The Council's decision would be the most important one in the Academy's history. The vote. The day of the vote arrived, and the tension in the Academy's council chamber was palpable. Matthew stood with Zora and Professor Zolfor, waiting for the outcome. The room was filled with the faces of the most influential members of the Academy, some who had supported him from the beginning, and others who were still hesitant, still unsure. Matthew's heart raced, but he didn't feel fear. He felt something far stronger: hope. Dean Fornix took the floor first. His voice was measured, but there was an unmistakable edge of bitterness to it. "We've heard the arguments. We've seen the data. But this institution has stood for millennia, and we cannot afford to throw away everything that has made us great. This new system may be impressive, but it is untested. It is a risk. But then, something unexpected happened. Professor Zolthor, Matthew's former mentor, and once a staunch supporter of tradition, stood and addressed the council. "Dean Fornix," he began, his voice calm but filled with authority, "there comes a time in every institution's history when it must decide whether it will continue to stand in place or whether it will step forward. Matthew Winchester has shown us the future. We cannot ignore it, for to do so would be to resign ourselves to obsolescence. I, for one, choose to embrace the future." The room fell silent, and for the first time, Matthew saw something change in the eyes of the council members. They were beginning to understand. It wasn't about tradition. It was about progress. The vote was close, but in the end, it passed. The Academy had decided to change.